A very pleasant good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Magandang umaga, magandang tanghali, magandang hapon, at magandang gabi sa lahat ng nakikinig at nanonood sa atin ngayon. Katipunan ng Demokratikong Pilipino. This is the Rita Gadi Chronicles, and thank you for having joined us. I hope that you can be able to gather some insights and some thoughts and whatever it is that we normally discuss at this time of the day. So again, as we've said, so many things are occurring around us, not just in our country, but throughout the world. There is a recession somewhere, there are problems financially, there are wars going on. And of course, we all try our best to pray so that there could be peace in the world. Within our own territory here, we have several issues that have been raised over the past months. Of course, the South China Sea will always be there, and the waters will always be there. And so all the discussions as to who owns the islets, the shoals, the reefs, the rocks, will always be part of the debate forever and ever. Amen. And then we also have what's happening on the domestic front. You are privy if you are still adept at listening to what's happening in the Senate and in Congress and in the House of Representatives. Actually, that's the entire Congress. The House of Representatives, these are the representatives of your districts, and then we have the Senate. And both are actually conducting inquiries, committee hearings, the quad as they call it, all of this discussing and trying to find out what could be the result of whatever it is that they're investigating, inquiring into, supposedly in aid of legislation. Be that as it may, it also brings to fore many of the activities of so many government agencies that ought to be doing their job but are probably reneging on many of the duties and responsibilities that they are supposed to perform. So, away from all of that, just recently, the president has met with several leaders, former commanders even, of the Bangsa Moro Autonomous Region. It is now called that after several attempts from the Tripoli Agreement of 1976 all the way to the autonomous region, all the way to the autonomous region of Muslim Mindanao, and several names and several memoranda of agreements that have been interchanged, exchanged, amended, rescinded, etc., between the government and this group, which are either the Moro National Liberation Front or the Muslim Independence Movement or the Muslim National Liberation Front, however else they may be called, until they come up with finally this BARM. But what is it that they're called actually? And that's the title of our program, the Bangsa and the Moro. Two words which are not even indigenously or organically Filipino. It is neither Magindanaon or Maranaon. It is not coming from the Sulu archipelago, where you have the three island provinces of Sulu, Basilan, and Tawi-Tawi. It's coming from outside the Philippines, but that is what was adopted as far as the autonomous regions of Mindanao are concerned. Bangsa, which comes from the Malay word bangsa, which means a nation. The Moro, which comes, Bangsa also comes from the Sanskrit word, an Indo-Iranian and Sanskrit word, Vamsa, V-A-M-S-A, which means the lineage. So you could see that Bangsa is not organically or indigenously or something that has stemmed from either of the languages that we have in the South. And then you have the other word, the Moro. The Moro comes from that word of the the Black Arab, I'm sorry, coming from Northern Africa. They were the Maure, coming from the central plains of Algeria and some portions of Morocco of Northern Africa. And they are predating Islam, as a matter of fact. These are the Moros, actually. So you could imagine that we have two words that are now used to name an autonomous region in southern Philippines, which do not belong to us insofar as the origin of the words are concerned. But be that as it may, I just wanted to point that out so that we not only have an idea of where we're getting all of this terminology, but also how is it that after so many times that they have come up with memoranda of agreements and all kinds of dialogue and meetings between supposedly a rebel group and our government, we still have not come up with something which is originally our words anyway. So, but that is how it is, the Bangsa and the Moro. Two words, as I've said, which come from way out, not coming from the island of Mindanao nor from the island provinces. So you have the Maure, the Moros, as I've mentioned earlier, and these are exactly what happened then. How come they were called the Moros now here in our country? So these are the lamentations that in ancient times, not really very ancient, but in the mid-centuries of the 17th, 14th and 13th and all the way to the 17th century, or the lamentations that spread to the Iberian Peninsula, and this is Portugal and Spain crossing the Mediterranean. So you could see that these are the Moros from Northern Africa, and they overwhelmed Spain, which was then called Andalusia, and Portugal in the 8th century, not the 13th, but much earlier. And that was in the 8th century. And so these are the same lamentations that we have heard in Mindanao when we speak of the Moros, because this took the form of the midnight assaults of the renegade Mindanao Moros over their own kindred in creed and culture over the Filipinos that are residing there in the island of Mindanao. So there have been several respites of peace, but not actually the maintenance and sustenance and the sustaining of peace, but there have been confusion of claiming peace in so many negotiations, etc., and all of this. And so we have here, for instance, well, over the past so many years, since 1976, we've had a nation that has watched blood spilled over the terrain, the mountains, and the places there in southern Philippines. So as far as we are concerned, or as far as I am concerned, because I consider myself as coming from Mindanao, time was when I looked at the Moro as a neighbor. And there were two towns after my town of Kidapawan. There is a town called Cabacan, which is predominantly Ilocano in population. And after Cabacan, we had Pikit and Pagalungan. So this is where I first had contact with the Moro in our province of Cotabato. Cotabato at this time was still the undivided Cotabato. You did not have north or south. And now you have 5 provinces actually. So Cotabato at the time, during my growing up years, was the largest province in the entire country. But my knowledge of the Moro, as I mentioned, was a neighbor from Pikit and Pagalungan. Or the Moro was either a patient of my father, who was a surgeon. The Moro patient was either confined in the clinic of my father for having an appendix removed, or a son was being circumcised, or a wife was going to give birth, but not normally, and so it needed a cesarean section. So that was my first contact with the Moro at the time. And then also I had a tennis match player, the wife of a former mayor of Pikit. And we played tennis at the old Narik compound. Narik was the great grandmother of what we now know as the NFA. National Food Authority. Prior to that, you had the Rice and Corn Administration, which was the RCA. Prior to the RCA, you had the NARIC, which was also the National Administration for Rice and Corn anyway. So there was a big compound in Kidapawan, and it had the only tennis court we had then. And that was where I played tennis with the wife of one of the mayors of Pikit Pagalungan, a Muslim, as a matter of fact. But at that time, they were not yet into the wearing of the old traditional habit of the hibab, etc. and all. So she had shorts when we were playing tennis. And of course, every once in a while, we had the sons of the datus coming from Pikit and Pagalungan who would come over for dinner. We would listen to music, which was the current music at the time. And we engaged in pleasant conversation. So that was we even listened to the Beatles, which was very popular then in the early 60s, 50s. So they were also graduates of colleges from Manila, also graduates of universities abroad from New York. As a matter of fact, they're residents of Greenwich Village when they were studying there. They had college degrees. I don't know if they were able to complete this, but they studied college also in the United States of America. So the Moro of my past was either the child of a Datu with royal blood veins from either the Raja Buayan or the Raja Mudas, or maybe even a Moro that was a peasant who was sent as a scholar to study Arabic and Islamic theology in Egypt. And I'm referring to Hashim Salamat, who was the librarian then of the provincial library in Pikit and Pagalungan. So those are my early associations of the Moro. And if the Moro then was descended from royalty, they were, well, whenever there was some kind of a formal affair, they were decked in the royal malongs, etc. They had gold inlaid teeth, and they also had gold bangles and neck pieces, and they had a retinue of attendants. And of course, they were addressed as Datu, or the son of a Datu, with a certain degree of honor and respect. So it was very feudal, as a matter of fact, and that was how it flourished at the time. The Datus were the little kings or the emperors of their respective territories. So you had all of this either involved in trade, in trading, in selling, in merchandising. And there was also the flourishing barter trade in the Zamboanga Southern Island provinces, where you had a lot of trading going on with Sabah, Malaysia, Brunei, etc., Borneo, as a matter of fact. So at the time, the 50s and the 60s, the Moro was the politician also, because they were the ones that ruled the little villages. The Moro was the governor, the congressman, or the senator, so of the biggest provinces that we had in the country. I was mentioning about the divisions of Cotabato, Lanao Sur, and then Lanao Norte. No, Lanao Sur was the predominantly Muslim province, and then you have Sulu, Basilan, and Tawi-Tawi. And so it was the Moro that lorded it over these regions for centuries, and on even to the present republic, until, of course, a lot of changes have occurred, as I've said, after negotiations with those who wanted to secede were undertaken. And so there were snippets of peace as it went on from that time until they had the Tripoli Agreement sometime in 1976. I talked about that Tripoli Agreement when I spoke about the trip that Mrs. Marcos was undertook when she went to Tripoli in Libya. And so, well, at the time, again, I would want to refer to what it was that I realized. The Moro was simply either a Magindanaon or a Maranao, or a Tausug, a Yakal, or a Samal, or some other more exotic names of the region, translated as the riders of the waves and so forth. And so, but then at that time, the Moro coexisted in peace and pleasant commonality wherever they were located. Now, the Moro, as I've already mentioned, was originally referred to as the Black Arabs from Maure in the central plains of Algeria and portions of Morocco in northern Africa, predating even Islam. So in time, when their conversion to Islam was complete, and Al-Andalus, or Spain, which was the original name, became the center of Muslim rule, culture, science, and intellectual activity blossomed to such amazing heights that the influence of Islam and of creative thought was said to have been inspired by many of the former philosophers that they had in ancient times. And this also inspired the writings of many Catholic and Christian theologians. So, for instance, we had St. Thomas Aquinas in the vast world of rational discourse, who was also influenced by many of the philosophical data that were derived from the Islamic philosophy. And then, of course, it was during this period of excellence and sophistication in thought and lifestyle that the people of different faiths, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim, coexisted in a spirit of mutual tolerance and enjoyed a healthy cultural exchange between and among themselves. Reason, not force, was the correct modus that operated on in the relationship of the Christians with Islam. In fact, in Jerusalem, which also originates from the Muslim word Darul Islam, or the land of Islam, Jerusalem, actually, you had there a very good relationship with the three fundamental religions that I just mentioned. Now, in 1492, after the end of the Muslim presence in Spain, or in Andalusia, Andalus as it was called then, and then you had well, of course, we all know about the Crusades and so forth, but then we had the Christian reconquesting the territories that were earlier held by the Islamic civilization that spread actually from North Africa, I already mentioned Morocco and Algeria, all the way to the Middle East, all the way to many portions of Africa, many countries in Africa, to Europe, to Central Asia, to India, to Malaysia, and finally to Mindanao here in the Philippines. So you see how that religion and that civilization traveled all the way from Northern Africa to the European mainland of Spain and Portugal, crossing the Mediterranean, and all the way proceeding to Mindanao. So, when Magellan, a Portuguese, who was actually looking for spices when he crossed the Atlantic and got here to our country, he was sailing under the Spanish flag. And he landed here in our islands, and this is where he met the Rajas Homonhon and several other datus in Mactan. And so you had the identity of the Moro that was resurfaced it resurfaced at the time when Magellan came. And of course, Legazpi came after several decades afterwards. But then that was how it was. So we look at the Moro today, and if we could remember the origins and the history that go with the name, and we see the other face of the Moro today that has been resurrected with the insistence to carve out a future from a past and the present impossibility because of the layers of historical errors. And so we have here the unmasking of many of the errors of history. And finally, the truth that we are surfacing a name which does not really belong to us, but belong to Northern Africa as the Maori or the Moros of Algeria and of Morocco. And so we now have to swallow this as an integral part of our sovereignty and, of course, of our national soul. That's the Bangsa Moro in Southern Philippines. Now, let me go back in time to how it was, So in the early 7th century, that was the religious movement that appeared in the margins of the great empires of the time. And these are the empires of Byzantium and of Sasanians. I have suddenly had an interest in all of this hieroglyphics that they had at the time, with the fantastic knowledge that was stored in many of their stone tablets. And so this was the kind of a movement that dominated the western half of the world. While in Mecca, in a town in Western Arabia, you had Muhammad, who began to call men and women to some kind of a moral transformation, a moral reform, a submission to the will of God. And this is what he expressed in many of his writings. And of course, all of this embodied in the book, the holy book of Islam, the Quran, and the different writings of Muhammad in the Hadith. And so, in the name of this new religion, which is Islam, armies that drawn from the inhabitants of Arabia conquered all the surrounding countries and founded a new empire, which was known then as the Caliphate, which included much of the territory of the Byzantine Empire and all of the Sasanian, and extended from Central Asia to Spain. And the center of power moved from Arabia to Damascus in Syria under the Umayyad Caliphate, and then to Baghdad in Iraq under the Abbasids. So here you have the movement of this civilization, Islamic civilization, and of the influence it has had over several parts of Europe, Central Asia, and all the way, as I've said, here in the center of the Philippines in Mindanao. So by the 10th century, when the Caliphate was already breaking up, the Muslim population had become, adherents to the religion of Islam. The Arabs, rather, had become adherents to the religion of Islam. And although you had Jewish and Christians and other communities in these areas likewise, it was the Arabic language, remember this, the Arabic language was the one that spread and became the medium of a culture which incorporated elements from the traditions of peoples that absorbed into the Muslim world. It expressed itself in literature and in systems of law, theology, spirituality, and then, of course, in the sciences. So within the different physical environments, Muslim societies developed distinguished institutions, and the links established between the countries in the Mediterranean basin and that of the Indian Ocean created a single trading system that brought about changes in agriculture and crafts, in thinking, in ideology, and they provided a basis for the growth of the great cities with the urban civilization expressed in the buildings of distinctive Islamic style. Sometimes you say, ay naku, ano yan, Spanish style. Hindi. It is actually Moroccan in a way, in many ways. So I just thought of giving that background because that begins the making of a world. And from there, you have all of the other countries and civilizations that to form Iran, Persia, of course, with the Xerxes and Darius, and then of course Turkey, and all the different innovations that occurred at the time, and the different scientific discoveries and that were preserved actually. So that is where we are deriving the wealth of knowledge and the wealth of the civilization of Islam, even and of the Arabs, even before all of this became already what it was, a troubled civilization because of, well, many of the episodes that came in between historically. Okay, so here I am again, as I've said, talking about how it was growing up in Mindanao, and my first knowledge of the Moro, plus of course my knowledge of and experiences with them. I've already mentioned how I met several of them coming from Pikit and Pagalungan, the neighboring towns. So I just want to mention some of the names so that this would give credence to how I was able to incorporate many of my thinking, and of course, not just the experiences, but many of my thought process and my mindset after knowing and meeting and conversing with many of these Muslim leaders at the time, and how this has come to form not just the dattolship or the rajas, but also the independence movement of several, which began as a peasant movement actually. So I'll get into that. But let me speak now of Pikit and Pagalungan, two towns which are still in existence today, two towns that are predominantly Muslim, neighboring towns of my town of Kidapawan. So that was my first-hand knowledge. So the head of that Raja or that Datoship was Datu Udtog Matalam. And he had several wives, and of course, that he ruled over the province of Cotabato. In fact, he was the governor of the largest province of the country, which was Cotabato province. And of course, his cousin, a very close relation, was Salipada Pendatun, who was congressman in the beginning as representative, representing Cotabato likewise, and then eventually became a senator. So these were my first-hand personalities that I knew. First-hand that I knew. In other words, I've met Dato Udtog Matalam many times. I know his daughter, the eldest daughter, by Tonina, who married Midpantao Adil, a lawyer. I will tell the story again of how I got into the knowledge of many of Hashim Salamat's movements because of this. And then we had Salipada Pendatun. He reached the Senate, and one of actually was number 3 in the hierarchy of the Liberal Party at the time of President Justado Macapagal. So you had Macapagal, and then you had Pendatun representing practically all of Mindanao, if you would call it that. And then from the Lanao provinces, we had Senator Dumocao Alonto, another big family, also of royalty. And then we had Rashid Lukman, also of royalty. This is the Lanao Sur province. But here in Cotabato, as I've said, the Datus and the Rajas, if you would call them that I have met and actually conversed with. You had Dato Sangki Ampatuan. He had an Arab lineage, and he was tall and Arab looking, as a matter of fact. So he was also mayor of his town of Ampatuan. And then we had the Sinsuats, Dato Odin and Dato Bla. I've met both of them. They were in the opposite political party of the Batalams. The Sinsuats were in the Nacionalista Party. I will remember that. And then I met other leaders, not leaders, but other royalty of the Raja Muda, Raja Buayan. We had Sandiali Sambulawan of the Raja Buayan heritage. Then we had Korokoy Moson. Then the Baragirs and the Birwars who settled in Parang, as a matter of fact. So these were the mayors and also the leaders and the members of the royalty at the time. This is also part of the lineage of Michael Mastura, Dato Mike Mastura, who is still there and running a university or a college. And then we had, as I've said, in the Lanao provinces, Dumocao Alonto, who eventually became senator likewise. And then his brother, Madki, became governor of the province of Lanao del Sur. And then the son of Madki was the leader of the Moro National Liberation Front in the Lanao Sur area. That was Abul Khair Alonto. And then you had Simeon Dato Manong, Magindanaon, and also several others from that area. We had Jimmy Lukman from Lanao Sur. He also became a rebel together with the Bulkair. Amelil Malajuk, who was known as Commander Ronnie. He was also one of those in the independence movement of Mindanao. His code name, his nom de guerre was Commander Ronnie. That's Amelil Malajuk. And then we had other leading Muslims who were also part royalty, but also these are the more learned ones, Bara Lidazan, of course. And then you had the mayor of this is the town that borders Lanao Sur and Cotabato, Buldon. It's up there in the mountains. And the mayor then was Mayor Bangon Aratok and his son Tomatic Aratok. They were also part of the movement that protested against martial law and part of the Mindanao independence movement. Tomatic happened to study in Central Mindanao colleges in Kidapawan, and he was one of my students. I already mentioned the eldest daughter of Dato Udtog Matalam, Bai Tonina, and she married Midpantao Adil, who eventually became regional trial court in somewhere in the Visayas. But it was during that time when Hashim Salamat who did not belong to any royal family, peasant as you would call it, was sent to Egypt to study Arabic theology and Arabic, the language, so that he could be able to teach in the mosques and of course the people as far as the Quran and the teachings of Muhammad are concerned. So Hashim Salamat was sent to Egypt and got exposed to the Palestinian Liberation Organization there. And that is where he learned that it is possible to declare some kind of an independence from Israel. Uh, and so he brought that back here and also started the Mindanao independence movement, calling for the independence of Mindanao from the Republic, patterned after how the Palestinian Liberation Organization organized itself to free itself from the rule of Israel in Israel. And then, of course, well, I already mentioned that it was because of Baitonina that I met Hashim Salamat, who became my interpreter when I went around the entire province of Cotabato, not just lecturing, but actually working for a federal form of government as an alternative to independence. So that because at the time that was how we treated, that was how we called Manila. That was how we called the central government, the gobyerno sa mga tao, the government of a foreign people. There was very little development that was being trickled down in Mindanao. And one of the reasons why there was this success in the movement of independence, precisely because not only were the peasants under the rule of the datus, but also under the rule of the central government of Manila. So nothing much was really happening by way of progress. So then, since we had an advocacy that in lieu of independence, maybe a federal form of government would be the best possible government management of our places in Mindanao, so that provinces that are contiguous could work together and design their own economic programs and also have the authority and the responsibility for taxation and the use of the taxes for whatever programs and projects they intend to set up, which is no longer just being, coming from Manila, because they would know best what is good. Where are they supposed to build a road? Where are they supposed to construct a bridge? What sort of institutions are they going to set up? So a federal form would be, at the time, this was in the late 60s and the early 70s that we were working for this. And Baitonina Matalam, the eldest daughter, introduced me to Hashim Salamat, who would do the interpretation in the language, in the Maguindanao language, of whatever it was that we were working for. A new constitution with a federal form of government, parliamentary, of course, for the rest of the country, but more so for Mindanao, so that we can counteract the independence movement by forming federal governments in several areas, not in several, but in the whole of Mindanao, as a matter of fact. So then, of course, I was assisted here, I already mentioned their names, Corocoy Moson and Sandeale Sambulawan, Musibuat, Professor Alunan Glang. Of course, he was teaching already, I understand, in the Lyceum and also some subjects in the University of the Philippines. By the way, as far as UP was concerned, I was also under the tutelage of the Dean of the College of Islamic Studies, Dean Cesar Mahul, who had a great influence on my thinking as far as the Islam religion and the Islam manner of governance is concerned. And then, of course, I already mentioned the Aratuks of Buldon. But I also have to mention my neighbors in Quezon City, the Alontos, the eldest son of Senator Dumacao Alonto, Alex. Alex Alonto was my neighbor there, and his wife, Sarah. And of course, through him, I met his sister, Zoraida Alonto, who married Mike Adyong, who is now the father of the Congressman Adyong that we have presently in Congress. So it's a small world that we revolved in Teachers Village. our street was called Masigla, and at the end of the street you had Soraya Alonto, and then my neighbor, next door neighbor, as a matter of fact, was Alex Alonto and his wife Sarah. And of course, the children were, well, were the playmates of my own of my sons and daughters. So that was how close we were to the Alontos here in Quezon City. As I've said, these are the Alontos from the heritage of the Alontos of Lanao del Sur. Then, of course, quite lately, when things are already um, getting to form and many of our Muslim brothers were entering into public service, of course, the Tilas. You had Santa Nina Tila Rasul, and then Al Tila, Al Marin Tila, and Ay Tila. These were the also of some Arabic lineage. If you will see their features, they had more or less. You could see that they had traces of Arabic features. So many others, and then of course from the Tawi Tawi province we have Nur Jafar, another one who was greatly assisted in the development of that island province. And of course, Nur Miswari, who comes from one of the islands in southern Philippines, and several others. So I mentioned these names because these are the people and the personalities that I have met, conversed with, and actually campaigned to, insofar as having an alternative system of government for the island of Mindanao. So I had to mention them only for the fact that when I wrote this piece, I'm sorry, when I wrote my thesis for Islamic Studies, which was the Masks of Mindanao, that was where I began to write down the prediction that there could be a civil war in several provinces in Mindanao, and this is because of my exposure to the Mindanao independence movement. So let me get back to that so that we can trace it from that beginning until what has become so many of these BARM, etc., and all, and the Bangsa Moro. So it was that Hashim Salamat, who was exposed to the Palestinian Liberation Organization, when he came back to the Philippines and back to Maguindanao, that was how he was preaching part of not just the Islamic theology, but also the need for have some kind of a political movement, which is to work for the independence of Mindanao, because apparently there was the perception that it is not being attended to by the central government. So that was where the Mindanao independence movement was born. And of course, Islam as a way of life and Islam as a world religion was part of the entire Islam civilization in all the countries. And so you had the Middle Eastern countries and our neighbors, Malaysia, Indonesia, and the other Muslim countries nearby, who came to the succor and the assistance of the movement that Hashim Salamat began. And that was why it gained ground in the sense that much of the literature and the narratives that were being presented in the Islamic conference in the Rabita. By the way, the Rabita is some kind of it's like the College of Cardinals of the Catholic Church, where you have the hierarchy of the imams, or supposedly the cardinals and bishops of the Islamic religion. That was the congregation that they had, the Rabita. It is like the College of Cardinals, as I've said. And the big mistake that our perception was at the time, we thought that the Islamic conference actually was the venue for airing our side of what is happening in Mindanao, because that was where Nur Miswari decided to present his thesis that a genocide was occurring in Mindanao, meaning that the Christian government was actually killing the Muslims, which was, of course, so untrue. And that was the reason why Libya, Jamahiriya Libya, under Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, came to the support of the Mindanao independence movement, not only ideologically, not only spiritually, not only religiously, but also in logistics. I mean, they sent support, not just by way of the thinking that Mindanao should be independent, but also in arms. So that was the supply that was coming in through the back door, reaching the island of Mindanao and passing it on to the different communities and villages where the independence movement was actually quite active. And so at the time, this was sometime in the middle 60s rather, we had bridges being blown up. I have to go back in time. Our bridges then were the bridges that were still built during the American occupation. We call them Bailey bridges because they were made of the Bailey steel, uh, which you see up to now. Some houses have fences with this um, steel walls, and that was how the bridges were built. That's why they were called the Bailey bridges. And as I've said, it was very easy to explode. And then, of course, you had the Philippine Constabulary, which was the only presence of the armed forces at the time, and they didn't even have what do you call this? They had their sentry points were like nipa huts on the highway, so it was very easy to overrun them when you had the arms coming from the Middle Eastern countries, especially from Libya, arming the independence movement. Kaya gera talaga. So you can imagine how it was. Paano ba kasi lumaganap yan? Well, let's go back to the political scenario at the time. So I mentioned already the names of Matalam and Pendatun that were in the Liberal Party. In the hierarchy, they were actually the number 3 as far as the national politics is concerned. And then, of course, in the Lanao area, you had Rashid de Lucmans and the Alontos also in the Liberal Party. The Dimapuros, wala pa yan. Hindi pa talaga sumisikat at the time, although the Dimapuros also claim some lineage with royalty, but because of the political powers, so you had 2 of the big leaders in the Lanao province of Lanao del Sur, which is predominantly Muslim, the Lucmans and the Alontos. And then in Cotabato, you had the Batalams and the Pendatons. Now, then a Nationalista Party president came to power. That was Ferdinand Edralin Marcos. So you can imagine how this political datos and kings felt that they are no longer seated in the corridors of power. So they took advantage of attracting the attention of the national government by supporting, in a way, or propagandizing the Mindanao independence movement. Para bang bargaining yan. O sige, pag hindi mo kami pagbibigyan dito kasi ibang partido kami, ayan, mag-aano kami ng independence. Do I know this personally? But of course, because as I said, Pikit and Pagalungan, which is the center of the independence movement with Hashim Salamat located there, I know exactly what was happening. In fact, I had to talk to Hashim Salamat himself to tell him that, pwede ba, wag mong pasabugin yung tulay na nagko-connect ng Kidapawan papuntang Cotabato City at yung isang tulay naman na nagko-connect ng Kidapawan papuntang Makilala at papuntang Davao. Kasi kung sakaling magkagulo, wala kaming dadaanan kung yan na bomba na. So the condition was, well, after a long talk with the rebels, sabi ni Salamat, okay, papayag kami na we will not touch the bridges there that connects Kidapawan to the outside world, outside of Kidapawan. But you should not arm yourselves because at that time pumasok na ang constabulary at an armed forces, and since most of the Christian towns are populated by Ilonggos and their mayors are Ilonggos, yung provincial commander there was an Ilonggo. Si provincial commander at the time colonel pa yon, Carlos Cahelo. So pinatawag niya yung mga mayors ng Cotabato at yung mga ibang mga leaders, bibigyan kayo ng armas, tutulungan kayo mag-armas para labanan yung mga nag-i-independence movement na yan. At the time, wala pang pangalan na yung mga rebels. MIM, wala, it evolved eventually, pero ang tawag pa sa kanila ng black shirts. At tapos naman yung mga Ilonggo, ang tawag sa kanila, ilaga, mga daga na tumatakbo naman para hindi sila, para makaiwas sila doon sa mga black shirts. So you could see how it was, the political and the military movement. So with the condition that I will not arm Kidapawan or my police force or have the military be stationed in Kidapawan. So hindi ako tatanggap because at the time I was acting mayor, my mother was already ill. So because of that, I had to make the decision that we are not going to allow ourselves to be armed, nor will we allow that the military or the armed forces of Colonel Cahelo will be stationed in Kidapawan. Remember, ang lapit lang namin sa Pikitan, Pagalungan. And as an exchange deal, hindi pa sasabugin yung mga tulay namin. So that was how it was at that time. So what happened was, because I predicted in my thesis that there will be a civil war, and it did occur, my thesis was confiscated by the NICA, which was the National Intelligence something under General Ver. So yung thesis ko ay kinuha nila sa Center for Islamic Studies sa UP, and I don't know where it went. But anyway, since I kept a diary, I was able to retrieve at least portions of what I wrote there. And yun nga sabi ko, The Basques of Mindanao nga yung title nun. And sometime after, well, it was already during martial law, when I was already working with Solidaridad Publishing House under F. Shanil Jose, he decided ilalabas yung aking, well, it's no longer a thesis. It's actually an article already for the Solidarity magazine. So the Masks sa Mindanao. Doon ko kinwento na yung kinakwento ko sa inyo ngayon. Kung paano nagsimula yung MIM na yan. At si Hashim Salamat na mumuno, he was actually the philosophical, ideological, and spiritual leader. Then you had Hussein Pangato, who was also part of the military arm of that movement, etc. Hanggang sa, as I've said, we were already flying the flags of Libya, not knowing that they were Libyan colors. Ang akala namin noon na yung mga flags na yon ay MIM. So when we were crossing Muslim territory, kinakabit namin yung flag na. I was driving a Toyota Land Cruiser, so nagkakabit na ako ng flag para may safe passage. It was only when we went to Libya that I realized that the flags we were attaching to my jeep was actually the Libyan flag, and that was early on. Of course, part of the intelligence of President Marcos, that he realized that it was actually Colonel Gaddafi who was the biggest supporter of the independence movement. And that is when he decided to send his wife, Imelda Romualdez Marcos, to Tripoli to talk to Colonel Gaddafi and explain to him and ask for the cessation of the hostilities and, of course, to work for peace. And I already told the story of that trip to Tripoli, not once but twice, that Mrs. Marcos undertook. And of course, the meeting that she had with Colonel Gaddafi after being told to wait for 3.5 days. As a matter of fact, hindi siya hinaharap ni Colonel Gaddafi. Although the invitation came as part of the formal official invitation extended when she spoke at the United Nations General Assembly. And so you had there the ambassador of state of Libya, Tricky Treki. I'm sorry, not Tricky. Al Treki, I call him Tricky Treki. It's a bad adjective. Dr. Al Treki, the Secretary of State, the Foreign Minister of Libya, who was part of the delegation there. And then, of course, also from Morocco, who was there. And then a formal invitation was extended to the Philippines to visit Libya. And so immediately President Marcos accepted the invitation, but sent his wife instead. So that was Mrs. Marcos who landed in Tripoli. Ang dami kasing mga do's and don'ts. Like we could not bring our television cameras. Na-cut down yung mga number of journalists na sasama sa kanya. And then, of course, we were not supposed to talk to anyone. It was supposed to be a secret mission. Hindi namin masabi even to our family members that we were going to Tripoli. We just said we were going to Rome or to Malta, which is the island closest na to North Africa. Kasi nga, kung sakaling magkabulilyaso or something would happen, whatever it is, wag nang subingaw. Now, we made such an attempt, tapos hindi na ba natuloy. So whatever it was a very delicate, sensitive and the highly secretive mission, so to speak. But we were there in Tripoli for 3.5 days with a full delegation, as a matter of fact, members of the armed forces, generals, and practically half the cabinet of the president was there, well, was with the delegation. But hindi nga hinaharap ni Colonel Gaddafi. So we had to visit. Well, Mrs. Gaddafi welcomed Mrs. Marcos at the airport. Pero for the following days, she was toured around Tripoli, the Children's Hospital, the museum, several other institutions, etc. and all. And then yung kasama ni Mrs. Marcos sa delegation, Secretary of Defense Juan Ponce Enrile, and the Deputy Chief of Staff, Fidel Ramos, decided after 3 days to go home, to go back to Manila. So they flew out of Tripoli and they were in Malta, and then they told President Marcos, pauwiin mo na si Mrs. Marcos kasi Gaddafi is not meeting with her anymore. 3 araw na kami, and there has been no sign. So we are now really on an open confrontation with the richest northern African country, Gaddafi, with a 2 million population na sangkatutak na oil ang kanilang ine-export all over. So that was how it was. But Mrs. Marcos insisted, sabi niya kay President Marcos, give me 1 more day and I will see what can be done. And so that's when she thought of perhaps first going to the mother of Colonel Gaddafi, because woman to woman, pwede niyang masabihan, oy, sabihin mo naman yung anak mo, ang 3 araw na ako dito. But then we also thought na baka hindi yan, siguradong yan ang nanay, because the Muslims sometimes have 2, 3, 4 wives. So sigurado ba kami na yan? And it's so embarrassing to even inquire from officialdom na who is the real mother. So it was Mrs. Marcos who decided, so let's go to the father then. And that was how we got into the desert close to Benghazi and to meet the father. And the father immediately, even as we were being treated to sumptuous lunch, ang ganda ng kanyang tirahan sa desert, it was fully carpeted, you had chandeliers, etc. and all. But whatever it is, we were told that Gaddafi would meet with Mrs. Marcos, and so that was it. And so when they first met, the first word of Mrs. Marcos was, I come in peace, and I would want to settle whatever is the problem as far as your perception is concerned. Mahaba ng conversation yan, nakwento ko na rin yan in several episodes of Rita Gadi Chronicles. And that was how it began, actually, that the conversation and the several meetings were undertaken with Deputy Minister Carmelo Barbero, kasi wala na si Enrila Muina. So it was Deputy Minister Carmelo Barbero together with his assistant and aide at the time, Colonel Eduardo Ermita. Colonel, now he's general and also has been Secretary of State of Mrs. Arroyo. So he's still alive today. So you could talk to him, interview him exactly how difficult it was, shuttling back and forth Manila and then conversing with the Jemaheria Libya officials and with Miswari, etc. Until finally, after another series of long conversations between President Marcos and Colonel Gaddafi, we had the Tripoli Agreement. And that was after several amendments, etc. and all. And finally, Gaddafi agreed, as President Marcos insisted, we cannot just include all of these provinces that are being demanded by the MIM. Kasi kasali ba doon ang Palawan kasama ang Davao, kasama doon ang what else was there? There were 3 other provinces, South Cotabato. So there were 3 provinces na kasama doon, including Palawan nga. So sabi nga ni President Marcos kay Colonel Gaddafi, we have to follow our fundamental law, the Constitution. We have to throw it to the people in a plebiscite. In other words, we have to ask the people, do you want to be part of the autonomous regions in Mindanao? And this is Region 9 and 11, together with a province in Davao. Okay, and Palawan, Palawan, Davao was also included. So there was a plebiscite. And again, as I've said, I covered that referendum firsthand. I was on television covering this live as the referendum was going on, and so I was able to interview a number of officials, both Muslim and Christian at the time, and was able to get a background of why the referendum is being held. And the background behind this was the Tripoli Agreement, which, if the referendum would agree, if the people would agree, either which way, we know exactly the coverage and the territorial area that will be covered by the Tripoli Agreement. So that was how it was. And then we had finally the signing after, as I've said, that long conversation and the referenda. So the provinces of Palawan and Davao and the other one, three other provinces were no longer part of the autonomous region for Southern Philippines, which comprised 10 provinces, 10 contiguous provinces, including the three island provinces of Basilan, Sulu, and Tawi-Tawi, and 5 cities. And the autonomous governments in the two regions, 9 and 12, will have their own parliament, their legislative arm, and they will be also having an executive council, which is patterned after a federal form of government, which was what we were trying to work for way back in the 1969, 1970. So that was it. The Tripoli Agreement was finally signed December 1976. And there was peace. And so from 1976 until 1986, the Mindanao Interventions Movement seceded itself. So nawala na yon. And then of course, Biswari was left there in Tripoli, nag-iingay-ingay pa, parang sabi nga niya na hindi pa ito tapos, etc. and all. But whatever it is, Hashim Salamat went back and then had to, operate within the territory that was already allotted for the autonomous region. He did not accept any position in government. Eventually, he also passed on. Lahat ng mga nabanggit ko pala ng mga pangalan, 90% of them have already gone ahead of us. You can imagine how old I am talking to all of this. Can you imagine Dato Sangki Ampatuan, one of the oldest of the Arab leaders that we had at the time? And of course, the Sinsuats, etc., and all of the Baragir, Birwars, and so forth. Dato Manong has also passed away. He was the first of the chairman of the executive council. Parang presidente siya nung parang, we did not call it a federal form of government at the time. We called it the executive council, but it already had the workings of a federal form. Or from then on, naku, pinasundo naman ni Mrs. Aquino, si Normiswari, nag-umpisa na ang gulo na naman. So, after that, nagkaroon ng mga sari-sari na mga MOA, etc. So, ang dami na naging pangalan, nagkaroon na ng batas na Autonomous Region of Muslim Mindanao, etc. and all. Pero yun na nga ang malungkot. Hanggang sa umabot na sa ngayon, sa kasalukuyan, na tinatawag na nga itong Bangsa Moro, which I am now differentiating Bangsa as a nation and Moro as the the African Arab. So be that as it may, we have now a Bangsa Moro, a nation that's supposed to be autonomous. But can you imagine this is very sad, the topography. You only have Lanao Sur, and then you have some other towns, villages in Lanao Norte where there's predominantly Muslim, some villages from North Cotabato, and then of course the three island provinces. Malungkot sapagkat hiwa-hiwalay. And then finally they had to make the center of the government in Cotabato City, which is not predominantly Muslim. But since there's already a big building there, which we set up during the time of Dato Manong. Incidentally, I worked also in the regional autonomous regions of 9 and 12 under Dato Manong. So we built that center. So kasi maganda, so ginamit na lang na center din ng Barb. But as I said, I have been very critical about how this is being organized, and I still want to think that somewhere in the near future they will think of going back to the provisions of the Tripoli Agreement, because that is where talagang mahihimay kung gaano kagaling ang pagkasulat nung pagkagawa ng autonomous regions na yon, which is, as I've said already, the grandfather or the grandmother of a federal form of government for Mindanao. And I wouldn't want to just call it Muslim Mindanao, because the Islamic civilization encompasses practically our entire country in a way, from the 8th century onwards. Can you imagine all the way up north? You had Princess Urduja, you had Dato Sumakwel, Dato Mohomonhon, Dato Sikatuna. It's all of this. And then, of course, like in Manila, Raja Sulaiman, who did not want to be conquered by Legazpi. So you can imagine in Villalobos, and so he burned his kingdom along the Pasig River. So maraming historical episodes na nangyari na. Pero sayang because we have to go back now in snippets of what history has taught us. And hopefully that at one time we did have a good provision for a semi-federal form of government which would have brought peace to Mindanao. Ngayon, ang dami-dami namang usap-usapan. President Junior Marcos making promises here, supporting again whatever it is that they're demanding, etc. Hindi na matapos-tapos. So as I've said, hopefully that the new Congress would realize how important it is to study and review the Tripoli Agreement once more and have these changes in the fundamental law, which will be conducive to actually that kind of a form of government for our island of Mindanao. And so with that, this is the Bangsa and that is the Moro. So let's see how we can put the two together. Thank you for having joined me. This is Rita Gadi, and this has been your Chronicles.